Have you started the meeting, or are you just on mute?
Thanks, Linda. Sorry.
Okay.
Yeah, start again, Brenda, if you don't mind.
Okay. So, to summarise that really quickly, so we had a session in November, Councillor Webb. Some of this will be going through that briefing again, just picking out some of the highlights. Slide one, where are we on the journey? We're about 60% of the way through it, and it is a journey. It is quite a process. This next stage is going to be quite crucial, the adoption of the draft and then out to further consultation. And we've identified we need a really strong steer from the community. And we'll be pushing every button we can to get those submissions in, because it will set the scene for the next 10 years as to how we deal with reserves and recreation spaces in the Buller district. So I think we can move to slide. The next one. So there's a lot of legislation that sits in behind this, the consultation, the things we have to consider, because these are an operative plan. They will inform our long-term plan, our annual plans going forward for the next 10 years. Not to say they're set in stone, that they won't be reviewed. And as things change, we will incorporate those into the plan, but it's certainly going to be another 10 years before we go through this entire process. So those are the kind of things we've got to consider: the Local Government Act, the Reserves Act, the Resource Management Act. We are giving consideration to the T-type Otini plan. And the outcomes are obviously an asset management plan, operational plan, levels of service. So it's quite important. It has quite an impact on how we operate. So what challenges have we got? Well, we've got financial limitations, as we all know, limited budget due to a small ratepayer base. There are environmental risks. A lot of our reserves and parks are close to high tide levels, by they're coastal or next to rivers. Community engagement is actually a problem. We have a high interest in our reserves and recreation spaces, but declining community engagement and volunteering. And certainly those things, not only do they help us steer where reserves and recreation spaces should go, but they also help us reduce a lot of the operating costs. A lot of people are doing really good things. So overarching all that is that, the need for a strategic and adaptive approach to reserve development in Buller, incorporating sustainable funding mechanisms. That's important. Climate resilient infrastructure, inclusive governance, and long-term planning. So we've been missing this for a long time. Yeah.
Sorry, take pause.
Yeah, just a question there. I mean, you've identified declining volunteerism affecting reserve upkeep. Then I think we should have something in that statement, next one down, saying that that's a focus that we need to try and improve, because that obviously offsets our needs for funding and
Absolutely
resourcing, etc. So I'd like to see that we implement some form of trying to, bolster those people.
We'll do what we can. So the next slide, these are basically the vision statements. It's about having those, recognising that they are important to people, making them safe and sustainable. They are the heart of a lot of small communities. And we have a lot of small communities, and a lot of these places you just drive past them, and some of them you wouldn't even know are there, but they are very well regarded and important. And I think we'll see that coming back through the submission process. We're going to go out a little bit harder than we did on the initial consultations, because we want that steer, not just from the reserve committees, as important as they are, it's the people who use those spaces. So we're going to approach schools, kindergartens. Even if we get a submission from a classroom or a school, we need to steer on what, particularly around playgrounds and things. What do you want to see? Where do you want to see it? I look at places like Waimangaroa, Marawea, and say, well, what are we doing there? What is the plan? And the plan has just been reactive. That is, people want something, have we got some cash? Is there enough interest in it? Then we do it. But this will give us some clear goals. It'll give you surety around those long-term budgets and those annual plans that we've got a plan to deal with it. The objectives is they're going to basically, we can say what we want for the reserves, but it's got to match with what the community wants. So they need to be used and appreciated. Enhancing recreational opportunities is, how do you get people to engage? What do they want? What is going to draw them to those places and use of it? And we've seen in Reefton, for instance, that if you do the right thing in the right place, you get more people going there. Just the small activation we did in Reefton has reduced vandalism in that area massively, and it's just by putting something that attracts people to those places. So well used, populated places are less prone to vandalism. We're alerted more and more to if there are issues, we're told because someone's seen it rather than something slipping into decline. Sustainable management and environmental protection. Let's not do stupid things in stupid places. And we're getting this constantly is, improving the infrastructure and the facilities that are available. The governance, maintenance and community engagement, that is just working with those reserve committees, trying to, we have reserves that don't have committees behind them, and they are the ones that are suffering. I say they don't have a purpose. They're just an open space, and maybe that's all the community wants. But we need to know this stuff, and planning and adapting these as those needs change. So what did we find out from our engagement? So there is a desire for more events, better amenities, and improved accessibility. Whether that's parking, better footpaths. Quite how we drive events is difficult. That typically needs a driver in that community to do something. I think the Waimangaroa Food and Music Festival was very successful, but they had a focus group that wanted that outcome, and they delivered it. Strong support for environmental enhancements and sustainability. So, we got feedback on plantings, all sorts of things. Safe, clean and well maintained. That's a challenge in itself. Reserves are typically large areas. Sometimes they're a bit larger than they need to be. Sometimes we maintain areas larger than what are being used. It's about prioritising that as well. Because they do have budgetary impacts. Just mowing, an extra couple of 100 square metres of grass comes at a cost. And we will inform that as it comes back out of this next round. When we get to a final draft, you will know what each reserve is likely to cost in terms of not just capital, but operating.
Thanks, Brent. We've got a question from Tony and then Shane.
Hi, Brent. So this is great. But a quick question around when do we update these? Is this going to be like in alignment with the annual plan or with the subcommittees full committee meetings where they set their annual plan for the reserves and buildings? So I just see it, that would be a harmonious way to do it. An
excellent question. One we have been talking about over the last few months is that disconnect between infrastructure looking after the hard things like buildings and amenities, etc., versus just the day-to-day reserve maintenance, etc. So we are working or planning to work much more closely with the reserve committees. So infrastructure will attend at least 1 or 2 reserve committee meetings a year, so we have an understanding of what you want in terms of the asset maintenance.
Sorry to interrupt, sorry, Chair. So what I'm saying is workshops, you don't make just decisions, okay? So usually how it happens is you have one full meeting a year after your financials. That is where you set your goals and make resolutions on any upgrades or anything new, or that is where you could be tidily capturing. So coming along to those 4 meetings would be a good idea.
Yeah, and that will feed directly into the annual plan. It's we had this at the last council meeting over the Reefland Electrical. Had infrastructure been aware earlier, we could have perhaps done something differently.
Thanks. Shane?
Just following on from Tony's statement, so these meetings, these formal meetings, for example, I know Carter's Beach have had theirs, they're one, they asked for 2, they've always asked for 2. In fact, they were lucky to get 1, some years there was none. And so that needs to be timed in September, October, so that these discussions with infrastructure can then be fed into the long-term plan or the annual plan. And this is something that we've been trying to say, because this is the frustration with these groups, is that we're told there's no decisions, it's run of the mill, but there are decisions made at workshops. And but for feeding into the annual plan, if we could guarantee the meetings are in September and October where that kind of information could be fed through, I think this is a challenge for your team, is that it needs to happen. You know, like these guys need to be enabled. The other thing I wanted to just make a note of is improved accessibility means accessibility for everyone. And in a lot of our reserves, we don't have disabled access to some of the amenities. And that's something I think that needs to be noted. And, you know, over time, if there's funding opportunities out there, that is something that we need to look at.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Shane, sorry, did you have a question coming up? Okay, if I could just ask just one, just from my understanding, you're the chair of the community committee. Okay, so you're talking about, interaction feeding into the long-term plan. How are you going to interact with the likes of Brent's team and other council before it comes back to full council for a workshop, let alone for a paper?
I'm not supposed to interact with Brent's team. Chrissy is. I'd interact with Chrissy.
Yeah.
So I interact with Chrissy. We've had these discussions with Chrissy around the frustrations with reserve boards. We have representatives who are dealing with the reserve boards who are hopefully going to bring any issues back to us that they feel are not being addressed.
Mm-hmm.
And we're also working on putting things in place, like changing terms of reference, which needs to be done. The reserve management plan is a key part of this, and that is probably the biggest part that's been missing to date.
Yeah.
So it's if this is in place, then there is a tool that can be used for to enable our volunteers to do what they really want to do, which is a better job.
And to respond to that, I think one of the tools we could use is and it's addressed later in this presentation, but this isn't set in stone that there would be an annual review.
Good.
And I think that's the option I've said it before, property split across 3 portfolios, and it's been problematic. But with infrastructure effectively taking the lead on some of this stuff, we're trying to be more inclusive across a lot of things. But there's it's for the likes of Carter's Beach, you've got a lot of asset. There's playgrounds, there's buildings, that sits with infrastructure. In terms of the community engagement, and with infrastructure also deals with the maintenance, the mowing, the cleaning, etc. But the reserves subcommittee's objectives typically feed through the reserve subcommittee liaison.
Yeah.
And it's just so that we both need to be in the room. So if there's a question around infrastructure, if there's a question around does this route need replacing next year, if this subcommittee say, I want this building repainted next year, and our guys can say, well, actually, it needs to happen next week, or it could last another 2 years. And having someone in the room who understands what our budgetary constraints are, that we don't have an open checkbook and can't repaint every building every year. So I think that will be really helpful. But the ideal for each individual reserve plan is to go to the subcommittee where one exists and say, is this still fit for purpose? Are these objectives and these actions, have they been dealt with? Do they need to be accelerated? The thing we said was medium term, is that now short term?
Okay, thanks, Brent. We've got a bit of a line up here, Tony, if we can work through it. I'll put your name down here. So we've got Councillor Hingston and Councillor Sampson, and I've got a list here, so don't worry.
Great, I'll be quick. The paper that so far is great. I like the enabling and empowering the communities and get on into it. I just have a couple of suggestions around the vision. And I think the vision statement is as good as it stands, but I'm always reminded when we do visions that we should think globally and act locally. And what I mean by that is that what I would like to see represented in it is focused on the community. I get that, that's great. But we're going to need more and more tourism in the Buller district, and we're going to need to make that a vibrant part of our community. So what I'd like to see as part of the vision, and I know primarily it's for the local communities, but to see it as a vision that we're inclusive, engaging, good hosts, and for both our national and international guests. And what it would be ideal if we could make our guests feel that we want to engage with them and we want to make them feel part of our communities that they're visiting. So I'd like that represented in the vision going forward. It's sort of implicit, especially when you see the Carter's Beach plan. It's ideal for people coming and visiting, but I'd like to see that implicit statement in the vision.
Thanks, Dave. Brent, if you can take that into consideration with the work you've got to go. Councillor Sampson.
As far as the formal meetings go, staff don't have to be there, do they? Because you can just call a formal meeting and so, you just make your decisions. But just carrying on from what you said before about being split up into different sections of the council, the most frustrating one is no response, and then being told by one, infrastructure team, this can happen, and then no response when you start asking questions as to when and can we carry on with.
Okay, well, I think my comment to that was, we're a new council, we've got a fresh start, so we take those things on board. Okay. Yep, we all heard it. I'm sure Brent heard that too. Thanks, Rosalie. So we've got Councillor Reedy, Councillor Hawes, and then Tony. Yep.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Very quickly, I get the impression people are talking about this reserve management plan perhaps being reviewed annually. Well, I disagree. I'm sorry to say. This is for me, it's like a policy. We review it every 2 or 3 years, whatever length of time. In front of me here, I've got one from Horata. They've had a management plan, and there's another one from Kerwee, of all places. Just a couple there. So what I suggest people do is it's all very well, and I thank Brent for doing this. I've gone through and looked at different management plan, reserve management plans, to see what they're all about and how they go about managing, if you like, these plans. So it is definitely not, in my view, an annual plan. This is an official document as to how reserves will be through the legislation will be managed, and that is through with the communities and all that sort of stuff. We identify what's required, and someone mentioned before, Brent might have said about a hall. We should know whether or not that hall in Waimangaroa needs work to be done on it in 2 years' time or 6 years' time. Of course, there's always going to be the unknowns, and I accept that. That's where we have to find. We can't find money, but I accept that we need to find the money to do things of an urgent nature, Mr. Mayor. So it's just a matter. Please, if you're going to do an annual reserve management plan, you might just as well forget about it, because it's going to be changed and changed and changed. And for me, a RMP should actually one size fits all for all the reserves. But obviously you then have the unique ones in terms of, you know, what needs to be done.
Thanks for that,
Carters and what have you, but
Thanks for that
that's,
feedback, councillor Hawes, and then councillor O'Keefe.
Yeah, so that's exactly what,
Maybe, Dave, if you don't mind, for the benefit of the people watching in public, you explain your role in terms of the reserves, which is a new sort of
okay,
role.
all right. So basically I'm sitting across all of the reserves as a governance representative. So that's to make sure that we get a uniform approach across everything and that we, you know, so we've got that level of governance fairness across all of these particular reserves and subcommittees. So Colin's quite right. This isn't about an annual operating. So from the reserve management plan, we'll end up with being able to have the asset management plans for each of these reserves. That's a separate thing, and that's the annual operating thing. So that's what Colin was trying to allude to, I think, there. Back onto why it's important, and this is a really good start of why we're doing this, is that it gives that surety and clarity to these groups working. So one of the reasons we're losing some of these people and getting frustrated and annoyed is because of having not got a uniform approach. So they've not got those things set out there, and they create all these frustrations. Jane quite correctly identified the fact that we need to have these meetings timed so that these groups can then feed into our annual plan and our long-term plans. That's another frustration that they've got. They want to do things, but if their meeting turns up and it's in, you know, April, they're stymied because they can't feed back into those plans. So all of these things are reasons why we've gone down the process of developing this. And that's why it's critical that we do get a one size fits all, that everybody knows where they fit within that. And from that, we develop the AMPs, the asset management plans, that each of these reserves operates under. And I just want to get that clearly out there. This is a critical part of how we start, critical part about how we use these assets throughout the district. And Dave quite correctly identified the fact that these do form a large part of what makes our district exciting, you know, great to visit, how we interact as a public with visiting people. I mean, all those things are really key. So this is not any small part. You know, don't diminish its importance.
Thanks, Dave. Can I ask another question of you? So what you've just described in terms of your role and where all of this is going, again, for the benefit of the people who are watching, how does that differ from what was happening before? What changes have really been made? Why is this going to make a difference?
Well, I identified the fact that people will know how to engage with council and feedback into a process. We won't be reinventing the wheel 10 times over in 1 year. We won't lose sight of where some of these things sit within our planning, which has happened time and time again. Anybody that's on a reserve committee, or Rosalie just said it before, basically, part of the frustration is that they come up with these, you know, the desires, the needs, the willingness to do things, but then end up being caught in a treadmill that goes nowhere. So I think that in the past, we haven't had a structure that's helped these people to then engage and feedback into the council structure to enable things to happen. Well, the other part about it that's really key is that there's some legislative requirements and some risks around some of these reserves. Some of these reserves manage things in terms of like campgrounds, and we've all seen the risks that can arise out of campgrounds with the unfortunate happenings up north recently. They have a lot of assets that they manage, which is also a risk to us financially. If those assets are not maintained properly, or, you know, and let go, they come back to us, as we've quite rightly identified in a number of other things that we own. the risks don't go away. The asset management, if it's let slip, will bite us at some point in the future. So it lowers the risk. It's identified risks that we haven't identified in the past. It's lowering those risks in terms of effects and on ratepayers and the need for rating. So it's a critical piece of work that we need to go through as the council, and we've got a large number of them. That's the other thing that you really need to realise in terms of our small council and our large area, because all of these communities have had these these reserves, these halls. We've got a large number of them in terms of our size as a council, so it's a big impact.
Not only have we got a lot of land that we're responsible for in terms of Buller District, but a lot of history behind these sorts of assets that we've got, and the community highly value them too. I did have another question for you, but just went and answered it with what you just said. So thanks for that, Jane. Sorry, Tony.
I kind of tend to disagree with Colin and Dave on the reserve plans. I think that the reserve plans, also the asset management plans, should be looked at every full subcommittee meeting, because if they don't, they just get forgotten about and put on the bottom of a shelf. They also, we have new membership. Everyone that it affects should have an eye on this once a year to get up to speed. Also too, looking at this as well, like it's got stuff in it about, like it's got kitchen, hall, playgrounds. Things change. Things, I just really think that yes, and that the main one will be the asset management, but this also needs to be hand in hand with that. Because I just see too many things like policies and plans being done, and then they just get done and then just get put in the back of an office and not even viewed. Or, I mean, what's the point? Also, too, the issues that the subcommittees have had over the years that I've been involved in is a lack of process. We haven't had a clear process, and so really this is a great start, and we are now through the community committee working on clear process that has got continuity that will be throughout all the subcommittees, so everybody's on the same page, with also a handbook so people can read it and understand, and everyone's from the same hymn sheet. Anyway.
Great stuff, Shane.
Actually, Tony, just what I said. So there has been a lack of process, but what that has showed in the last couple of years is actually the increased risk in health and safety. So because we do have public facilities like campgrounds, we really need to be aware of what the risks are and what our responsibilities are. We also have to, you will get volunteers that actually want to do their own thing, but actually we can't let them. And that's part of Dave's job, is to ensure there's some consistent governance over the top, so that we don't have reserve committees going off and doing stuff that they shouldn't be doing, because it is a risk to us as council as well. And so we want to enable our volunteers. I think, Colin, I hear what you're saying, but I think maybe at least for the first couple of years, I think we do need to review this to make sure it is the right document. Yeah, so it's this is a great start, but it is long overdue. And
thanks, Shane. That's really good feedback. Now, just a time check. We've got 20 minutes. We'll go to Rosalie.
I hear what everybody's saying, and yes, I've been around the reserves committees for a long time, and a lot of them are quite different, and we have to respect our volunteers and not treat them as though they don't have the wherewithal, for the fact that they are very conscious. They're aware of health and safety, but to have some of it drilled into them over and above at times, that's where you'll lose the impetus. And I just think it's horses for courses. You deal with the type of people on your committee as to what they are, but you have the roles there. And I think you'll find what I have found they're very health and safety conscious.
I'm sure I'm going to hand over to Dave, and I'm sure they are. But you know, some of the things they may not be aware of are the legislative requirements and the standards, Dave.
Yeah, nobody's trying to, to do something to people or control people that's not necessary. We're never going to step over the mark, but we are going to make sure that legislative requirements are met, because the risk is not to those people only in those situations. The risk is to our ratepayers. As we all know, when things are all right when they're going okay, when things go wrong, there's a cost. There's implications, and those costs are not just financial, but those costs can be quite substantial in other ways. I realise that in some respects, volunteers are considered slightly different under the Health and Safety Act, but in some areas that crosses over into legislative requirements under that act. And that's what we need to ensure, because at the end of the day, the man sitting at the head of the table here is the man that ends up being held completely responsible. And therefore it is, as a governance team, it's up to us to make sure that we make sure we meet all of those requirements. And really aware that we're working with people and they're doing it voluntarily. I mean, that's a key. I said that right from the beginning of this discussion, that we need to identify clearly that these people are our most important asset. And we clearly need to identify how we can facilitate getting more people involved in volunteerism. That's why I said it right from the get-go. But health and safety is a non-negotiable item.
And I think though, just picking up on what you're saying, is that, you know, it sounds like there's quite a bit of work that needs to go into this, you know, to get it right. But in my view, it should make it easier in the long term for those volunteers, you know, to be able to comply. I think, Dave, did you have something?
Yeah.
And then we'll go to. Okay, Phil.
Yeah, thanks. Look, I was probably too busy reading something else at the start of this workshop, or either that or I've completely missed what we've been talking about. My understanding is we're talking about an overarching plan for all our reserves, many of which do not have committees. This includes what happens in our Pūnakaiki motor camp, our reserves fields, playing fields. So am I right in thinking that your intent is to develop an overarching plan, and the various subgroups will have their own plan sitting below it? Carter's Beach, Mohikanui, they will develop a plan of their own that's a subset of your master, let's call it the master plan. Am I right in understanding that?
Not quite. So each reserve or recreation space will have its own, from the feedback we've had, whether it's through a reserve committee or it's just public submissions, we will develop, and we have developed, what their action plans look like. From that, we can pull out what the consequences are financially, whether it's an operational budget or a capital works budget. So it's not so much one size fits all, but a structured plan that looks the same for each. You know, the same headings, this, you know, what are we doing in this space? When are we going to do it? And from that, how much it's going to cost? But what does it look like over time?
We pick up on Dave's comments in terms of health and safety. You know, there will be an overarching standard, if you like, that will apply across the board, just as an example. Dave, is that where you were coming from?
Well, in a handbook, the will cover all requirements will be something you alluded to earlier on. It will be an operating handbook for these groups.
Which is separate from the reserve.
Separate from
Yes.
this.
Yeah.
Clearly identifying us.
Thank you. Yeah, that's operational.
It's tough.
Yeah. Ronnie.
Can I just bring us back to the fact with the reason that we have this, that we have to do this, the Reserve Management Plan, is because the Reserves Act 1977 requires us to have have a reserves management plan for each of our reserves, the way that we have done, and the reason they do it is that a plan will contain objectives and policies for the management, protection and future development of a reserve. So that's the level that we're working with, and then we're bringing it down to those individual levels, which has been as a result of the feedback that we've received. But it is a strategic document. It is a document that will, out of it will fall things. But at this level, it is quite a strategic document at quite a high level. And even when we're talking about the individual reserves, it's still quite a high level about the sort of things that want to be developed.
Thanks, Bonnie. Dave, thanks.
Yeah, I'm glad I gave their priority because they basically just clarified what I was going to mention. And I was going to say that this is a strategic plan, long term. And by virtue of the fact you're dealing with assets like halls and grounds and everything, an asset management plan is required. And asset management plans are multi-year. They go, 10, 20, 30 years. Look at our own infrastructure plans. So those sorts of things are the vision, the objectives, and the framework, the policy framework that you have. Pretty much they won't change from year to year, but maybe fine-tuned. But sitting underneath that is going to be things like priorities for funding, things like all the asset management plans for the individual reserves. They'll all sit underneath that, and they, by virtue of the fact that they're buying for money every year, will need to have an annual review of their priorities. And they can do that. I think if we are satisfied with the fact that this strategic document is going to provide the framework for us to work within, which I think it does. It gives a clearly stated vision and objectives and an operating method for getting things done in the best possible way and empowering and enabling our communities. And then we can review it annually, but there's parts of it that we review. We don't review the big strategic things. They've got to go 3, 5, 10 years.
I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but there are legislative requirements for annual plans, long-term plans, et cetera, but that should never take our focus away from continuous improvement wherever the opportunity presents.
That's right. So we set the review times, and we just got to be clear about what we're reviewing. We're not reviewing, the big picture, the policy framework and the overarching things. We might just do a quick check and make sure it's still working for us. But to enable the community boards and everything, they need to have at least a sort of 3-year plan, if not a 5-year plan, because they've got assets to manage over a multi-year program. If they don't get $40,000 this year, they need to get it next year, or they need to have a $20,000 per annum sort of to develop it. Whatever that is, we can make that work for them. They can.
A question coming out of what Dave said in terms of asset management, will this approach, enable a more fairer and equitable distribution of resources to these assets?
Short answer, yes. If we look at the internal review, the first line is key, consider feasibility and budget constraint. Right, we know we can go out and spend $500,000 tomorrow on our reserves, but that's unaffordable. So we have to take these outputs and then line them up against we know what our communities can afford and prioritise. So I think when we were talking about the reserves contributions fund, I'm not sure if all the councillors were in on that discussion, but we talked about inequity that and I don't want to throw Carter's Beach under the bus, but it is probably one of the better managed reserves, so it's got a lot of community involvement. It has a strong voice.
Where's this?
It's Carter's Beach. Carter's Beach is probably one of our best maintained reserves because it is extremely well staffed by volunteers, and it has strong leadership and a stronger voice. But because we're constrained by budget, we should be looking over the entire portfolio and saying, well, this is in desperate need. You know, maybe it only serves 20 or 30 people in that community, but it's in desperate need. And I think we made that argument, actually, I think it was Graham Naylon, so it would be the previous council, where he said we need to bring basically all our halls and things up to a standard before we start getting others to a higher standard.
Tony.
Yeah, and over the last few years, you've been going over to look at all of the assets,
Yep.
and you've had a look at all the assets, and now council's got the full picture on what assets are council's, what sort of condition they're in. It's all been documented. Now you know, because before you wouldn't even have a clue half the stuff that was out there.
No. So, and that's fair.
Right. Okay, guys, we've got about less than 10 minutes to go,
Right.
so we'll call it 5. Over to you, Brent.
Okay, right. I'll try and race along without glossing over too much. Basically, we did an internal review, and out of it came a draft, which we've presented previously. These are the things that we considered. When I saw the first draft, I wasn't particularly satisfied with it, so I got it looked at externally by War Infrastructure, who do a lot of the reserve management plans for a lot of councils in New Zealand, just ask them for their opinion. It was missing a few key pieces, so we did an external review. So that focused on the compliance. Are we meeting the statutory requirements? The content was a bit hard to read too. It was very wordy. So they streamlined that and made a really quite a punchy thing, which we'll get to quite shortly. So we're presenting each reserve consistently using simple things like the same reserve is called the same thing throughout the document, which I think would be straightforward, but wasn't. So we're using Carter's Beach as the example here. So basically it has a front page, which is the area to the left, with all the legal descriptions. That's the policy. That's the compliance with the Reserve Management Act. We specifically describe it. Some of these reserves are a lot bigger, as I said before. There's areas that are maintained and are clearly the reserve, but there's often, even at Carter's Beach, the Carter's Beach Reserve is actually a lot bigger than you think it is. We listed, basically a very quick summary of what's there. And what the vision is for that area. Yep.
Or are they just there?
Well,
because it's Wi-Fi enabled, those things are important. No.
It is they will be listed as individual assets within the asset management, the asset register for that domain, or that reserve. Yeah, we could dive into more detail, but
I was just thinking, if we had a civil defence emergency, we could look at a reserve and go, oh, yep, that's good. They've got emergency water there. They've got, or I know that comes under civil defence as well, but I just thought it might be useful to have those things there.
But that's a good idea, Shane, is having a crossover of information about if these reserves have got different things, which I guess, correct me if I'm wrong, but the solar panel project that's underway is a good example, I guess, of shared assets.
Yeah, we could provide more detail on it. But it will change obviously over time. Most of it's an EOC, it has water, it has internet. May or may not have solar.
Okay, back to you, Brent.
Okay.
Slide
Next slide. So this is basically the reserve action. So everything to the right of the green strip there. So we've broken it down into 6 key focus areas. So tourism, visitor experience, wayfinding, that's something Councillor Pinkston was alluding to. One thing we did pick up is not a lot of signage at our reserve. So if you pull up at one and you're not quite sure what it is, or we could be doing wayfinding. So Carter's Beach Reserve, here we are, you can do this, 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 and this. If you're looking to park a motor camp, or where's the nearest dump station, where's my next destination, Now, if you're going north, the next reserve's at Waimangaroa, or there's a dump station in Westport, whatever. We have sort of slightly strayed from the requirements of a reserve management plan, and that we've included OPEX, because if you looked at the annual plan review, where we had the pie charts, parks and reserves, our capital spend is quite low, our OPEX is large. So a lot of these reserves don't take a lot of capital, but they take a lot of operating expense. So ideally, we're going to come back to you and present to you each reserve what it's going to cost. When they're asking for more of this or one of these, if it's CapEx, that's the impact on rates. If it's, we want to expand the reserve by another hectare, this is what it's going to cost you in OPEX. So you can make those informed decisions, and we can have a running counter saying rates are going up for parks and reserves by 1% because we've approving this, and this.
So just a quick question, is it intended that this form the basis of a criteria when they do a funding application?
No, not at all. I don't think anything's off the table in terms of external funding. If a reserve committee decides they want to do something that's not even on this list, someone's had a great idea, they're free and independent to basically set their own.
I was talking more about the headings. Like, it would seem to me that the headings you could talk about, if you're applying for funding, it ticks this box, it addresses this.
Yeah.
It just gives you a framework for your funding applications that I think could be quite useful.
Yeah, absolutely. So that's the kind of layout. A lot of the reserves, to be fair, are very basic, because it's in some instances it's a patch of grass that gets mown, 5 times a year, and that's it. There's little community involvement. There doesn't seem to be any great drive to do anything with it. All we're saying in those management plans is we're committing to maintaining them as safe, open, and accessible until we get a steer. And hopefully this may be actually not confronting it, may a reserve that's not well managed or well used or well maintained or lacks facilities, maybe what we release actually spurs some community action. They say all this thing's being neglected, there's no plans for it. Well, actually, I wouldn't mind flying my model plane around here 3 times a week. And they can submit to it, and we can put it forward.
Actually, on that note, there's no place for risk. And, if I was talking, because Carter's Beach is up there, we've got things like we've got an airport next door, and so there are restrictions around things like drones on the reserve, and that kind of stuff's not on here, and it's not anywhere. And I wonder whether it should be, like, if we're talking about recreation, somebody might take their drone along there, and actually they can't fly their drone. We couldn't fly kites.
And that's where we should have a sign that says you cannot operate a drone in this area.
Where are we noting those risks? Yeah, okay. So that's something we need to probably build for each reserve around those. Add to them. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, Brent, how are we going?
I think we're just about through. So this is just like next steps. Where are we? So we're coming back in 2 weeks' time with the full draft. You'll see that well in advance. Then we go out for 2 months of community consultation. So that will be through to early August. We are hoping this is going to be one of the highest consulted or submitted to plans. Fingers crossed. As I said, some of these things may actually provoke some responses, which won't necessarily be a bad thing. It will give us a good steer. As you said, we've got, this is a document that sets our path for 10 years. We're not legally, we'll compile all those responses and we'll extract everything out of those. Whether it's an OPEX cost or a CapEx cost, we will try and determine those and give you basically an item by item. I think that's a great idea. We support it, or you know, there's a lot of people, a lot of interest in this idea. I think we have to support it, but this is the cost. So you understand what the implications are. We're not required to hold hearings. And that will be, I think, we get that community consultation, we get that advice back. And that will be part of the paper coming to you, is do you want to give people the opportunity to speak to their submission? And that's a decision. For
Okay, well, we're gonna have to wrap up now, Shane, but just on that point, I would imagine that you do. Oh, no, you ask your question, yeah.
Oh, no, I'd like the reserve boards to be able to speak to their submissions. Like, I don't think the whole of the community does, but the reserve boards, I think, need to have the opportunity to speak to their submissions.
Okay, so that will be a decision item in the paper.
Yeah.
So if we hold hearings, we'll be doing those in September. Then one more workshop in October for that, those deliberation, you know, basically a line by line. You know, council supports this. We understand what the financial implications are, then we adopt the RMP. And that's it, where our course is basically set, except for the next slide, Bronnie, which says implementation. So we've got an operational plan, we've got an asset management plan. We've sorted our funding because we know what our implications are for long-term plan and annual plan. Monitoring evaluation is just an ongoing assessment and adjustment. So that may be from your annual thing. This has now happened at the Mokanui campground. We would like this or that. But the big review, we're at full consultation, etc. That's, as Colin said, that's a 10-year thing. It's not going to happen like this every.
Okay, thanks, Brent. We've got 5 minutes, and I want to do a wee bit of a wrap up. So, Linda, have you got a quick question?
I just had a question about the deliberations in a workshop. How would decisions be made in a workshop for deliberations?
Is that relevant to the discussion we're having here at the moment on reserves?
Is that not what the slide before just mentioned?
Okay, maybe I'm getting a wee bit tired. Okay, sorry, Linda.
The workshop.
Okay, Brent.
Yeah.
Sorry, Brent.
Yeah, so the answer, Linda, is yes. The workshop will have a deliberation aspect to it. Probably form the.
So, can you make a decision at a workshop?
No, it'll come back to council.
For final adoption.
Okay, thanks, Brent. Yeah, I know where you're coming from, Linda. We probably need a wee bit more discussion on that at some point. So, okay, we're going to finish on time. It's been a long afternoon, so a very big thank you to Simon and staff for the excellent presentations today. And I think around the table we've had some really, really good discussion. Let's go forward. So thanks to everybody. Alan, thanks for attending too. And to all those online, thanks for showing an interest, and we'll see you, I guess, next time at our meeting. Thank you.